Hi everyone, my name is Richard Santoro and I welcome you to Third and Zen, the YouTube channel where every week I'm sharing a spiritual message to nourish ourselves, heart, mind, body, and soul. First, thanks for stopping by the channel. Thanks for checking out today's video. I do hope that this video finds you doing well. I hope that you are taking the time, the energy, the effort, the love, the patience, the understanding, all of it, to care for yourself, heart, mind, body, and soul. With that being said, let's take a nice deep breath. Just take a moment. Just be still, just breathe, just get ourselves ready. And let's get started with today's video, shall we? I say today's video rather than today's message because today we're going to be doing a little Bible study. We're going to be talking about a story from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. It's a massive, wonderful, amazing story. I haven't done this in a while. Jumping into more of a Bible study video since around Christmas when we did the Nativity, and I've missed it, so I'm excited to do this. This is a really, really cool and unique story. Part of why it's unique, it's the only miracle that exists or that is written in all four of the Gospels. It's a big deal. It's one of only two stories that, aside from all the Passion Week, the crucifixion and the resurrection stuff, it's one of the only two stories that take place during Jesus' ministry that all four of the Gospels talk about. So it's a really, really big deal. Now, considering the fact that it's in all four of the Gospels, I've been thinking about this one for a while, and, part of me wanted to do a compare and contrast with all four, but that is a video in and of itself, where you just take the one story and look at the differences between all four, because there are differences. What's in the story, what comes before, and what comes after. But I'm not going to put all that on our plate. That's just too much. So I opted to focus on the Gospel of John's version, because the Gospel of John is so deep, so complex, yet at the same time is simple with a narrative. You can just read, depends on which level you want to read it on. It offers so much. So that's why. I love all four Gospels, but I love the Gospel of John. So I'll leave down in the description links to this passage, John chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. And I'll also leave links to the other locations where you can find the same story, the versions of this story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you want to pause it right now and go read all four of them and then come back, go right ahead. However you want to play this is up to you. So let's do a little bit of introductory information. I said a little bit. Every time I say that, it goes and goes. The Gospel of John is full of so many themes and motifs and things that the author or authors are doing. One of them is signs. There's 7 signs. This gospel, in many parts, is written and gives a theological depiction of Jesus's life, ministry, and crucifixion and resurrection partly through the lens of Jesus showing signs of who he is. And there are 7 of them. There's also Jesus giving 7 I am statements. I am the bread of life, which, spoiler alert. So this is the 4th of the signs in the Gospel of John. 6th chapter, there's already been 3, there's 4. So that's something huge. It actually, let's see, how much more do I want to do? There's a lot of other themes. I'm not going to get into it. We will get into it as we read. The other thing that I want to mention, you know what? That's enough introductory information. I could talk about the Gospel of John in each passage and its themes, but I'm not going to. I could just keep going and go. We're not going to. So let's get right into it. Oh, it's just a little over 4 minutes. That's not bad. Bottom line, Gospel of John, early on in Jesus' ministry here. We're going to read one of the miracles that is told about in all 4 of the Gospels. This is John chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. I'm reading from the New American Bible. If you want to read along, if you have a Bible, go ahead and read along. If my translation is different than yours, and as I'm reading it, you're reading along, don't let it throw you. Don't wrestle with it. Pause the video, read yours, come back, listen to me, or just set yours aside and listen to the words. So we're gonna read it, and then we're gonna unpack it. Okay, so Gospel of John, chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. Okay. After this, Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee of Tiberias. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain and sat there. Verse 3. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him, because he himself, Jesus himself, knew what he was going to do. Philip answered Jesus, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little bit. One of Jesus' disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to Jesus, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good are these for so many people?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had their fill, he said this to his disciples, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign Jesus had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who will come into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. All right, I'm going to take a little sip of water. Now we're going to jump in. Now there is a lot to talk about. There's a lot to visit here. And because that's the case, and because I get so adrenalized and so into this, I enjoy it so much, I'm genuinely going to do my best to take it from the first verse and go on and unpack it. Because if I bounce around, it's going to be mayhem. I don't want to do that for me or for any of you. So, first things first. It's important to note what comes before a story and what comes after a story. All 4 of the gospel writers, all 4 of the gospels and their authors, they have an intention. They have a theological intention with everything they do. They're all coming at the story and stories from different angles, and they're all telling their own theological story. They have their own intention. I've said that 3 different ways now. I'll stop. So what comes before and what comes after is important. We won't really talk too much about what comes before. I've already said that this is the 4th sign. What comes after, we will talk about. So if you want to pause and just go glance, go right ahead. I mentioned that, that's all a long way of mentioning that this author or authors does nothing by accident. If you notice right there in verse 1, after this, the author is always connecting the narrative and connecting the multiple theological themes and messages that the author or authors are trying to get across. I'm going to stop with the author or authors. I'm just going to say the author, okay? I'm not going to get into too much of the authorship to this gospel or any of the gospels. I'll just say the author, okay? So you know. So after this, Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee, okay? A large crowd followed him. As we can see, Jesus is very popular. The crowd's following him at this point in the story. Like in Mark's version, this author denotes that the reason, as you can see here in verse 2, a large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Now, I don't say this to knock the crowds. I don't. Some people might, and that's fair. But like in John's gospel, like in Mark's gospel, the author here is pointing out that the crowds are following him not so much because of a deep-rooted faith or belief, but more so because of the wonder, the signs, the things that he is doing. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't knock them or anyone for not getting to a level of deep-rooted faith or belief. It's a journey for everybody. And for these people in particular, Jesus is still very early. And one cannot expect everybody to be on board so quickly. As we will see with what took place at the end of the story isn't finished. The whole Jesus story is not finished. So we can't really expect people to fully know like we know. So that's one thing. They're following Jesus based on they're going to see Jesus because they're going to see a rock star. They're going to see a show. They're going to see someone really interesting because this person does these signs and miracles. Okay, so that's verse 2. Then verse 3, Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. One of the big themes in the Gospel of John is dichotomies. Up and down, above, below, light, dark. The fact that dichotomies themselves are a theme, but also up and down themselves are a theme. So Jesus went up on the mountain. Now, let me pause here for one moment and throw some stuff at you. One of the big themes that take place during the entire gospel. Oh, this gospel is just amazing. The levels that it works on, and you can still gain fruit from it without knowing these levels. But a big thing that's transpiring is, and this happens in the other gospels, particularly Matthew's gospel, where Jesus is presented as replacing things, as replacing Moses. That takes place early in Matthew's gospel. The author is presenting Jesus as the new Moses, but better. Moses 2.0 and more. This author is doing the same thing. There are events and stories and things that take place that transpire where Jesus is not just replacing Moses, in the story he is, but he's replacing Judaism. And when I say replace, I don't mean throwing out, but all the foundational things, the markers that are Jewish religion and culture and thought and ideology, Jesus is replacing, not to throw it out, but just to show, I'm here. This is all better. I'm the better version of this. I'm the better version of that. So, in verse 3, when we see Jesus went up on the mountain, this is placing Jesus in a type of way that Moses is depicted in the book of Exodus, whether it's Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, depending on the authors of the version of Exodus, which is pieced together by various authors. Thus far, in this gospel thus far, Jesus has already replaced, and I have this in my notes, the amount of notes I have on John's gospel. Make a book out of it. Basically, this is a new type of Exodus. Jesus up on this mountain, and thus far, Jesus has replaced, or the author has shown us Jesus replacing the ritual purification, the temple, and the Sabbath. Now it's Moses and the Passover are what's being replaced, and we see it's already getting set up here in verse 3. Verse 3, already gave that much. There's already that much there. So Jesus up on the mountain, and he sits down there with his disciples. Now, in this gospel, it's not 12 disciples. There is literally no mention of the 12, because for this author, it's different. For the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the 12 is more important. It's more symbolically important, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. For this gospel, there's no mention of the 12. That's not as paramount. There are disciples, close followers that take more of the take the forefront rather than the ones that do in the synoptics. And we won't get into that too much. But the 12 aren't as important. So we do have his disciples, his closest followers, Jesus sitting down like a teacher would do in this time, or in many times, in many cultures, sits down at the feet, sits down with his disciples. He's sitting down, hanging out with them. It's a beautiful sign, beautiful setting, I'll say that. Okay. Verse 4, the Jewish feast of Passover was near. Quick pause. Again, like I said, this author does nothing by accident. Every word in every line, there's a reason for it. It's not filler. It's valuable. The idea, the story has literally nothing to do with the Passover per se in the narrative, but one, it is sort of letting people know around the time that it is, but also it's placing the Passover symbolically, thematically within the story, because as we'll see with some of this and what comes after, this is Jesus replacing the Passover, so to speak. Also, this is the gospel where we're able to put the math together for how long Jesus' ministry was, 3 years, because there's 3 Passovers mentioned. There's one, there's another one, and then there's the final one around the time of the crucifixion. where the other three Gospels only mention the Passover that leads into what we know as Holy Week. So, Jewish Feast of Passover was near. It's also in part mentioned because there's a chance that that some of the people that were present perhaps were pilgrims that were traveling to Jerusalem for the Passover, not just local people or people within the area. And that's a cool thought. So let's see what else. Where are we? We are at verse 4 here. Let's see. Is there anything I want to miss that I don't want to miss? People like myself and many Christians, but like myself that live on an island, raised on the water, the idea of Jesus being on the water, the fishermen, all that, so much water, and not just water in general, but seawater, the ocean, being out on the water is very prevalent. And people like me, we connect with that. Many of us do. But a lot of what takes place with Jesus, a lot of important moments like this one, also take place on a mountain. So whether it's mountains or the beach, I say the beach. I default to the beach. Whether it's mountains or by the water or sometimes both, important moments. So this is another important moment of Jesus's gospel story that takes place on a mountain. Again, very reminiscent of Moses on Mount Sinai. So it plays very strongly to the Moses elements in the story. So let's see, where are we? Verse 4, the Jewish feast of Passover was near. I think I said everything I want to say about that. Okay. Again, the above and below theme. The above and below theme, not just mentioned going up the mountain, but sitting down with the disciples. It's always there. Verse 5, when Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" Now, raising his eyes. He raised his eyes, again, note the above and below, raising his eyes to... I've said enough about that, raising his eyes, the above, below. One important thing to note, in this gospel, it's Jesus that takes the initiative to address the fact that there are many people here who need to eat. When you read the other three synoptics, there's a different theology happening there. So it's the disciples that say, what about the crowds? We should tell them to go home. It's getting pretty late, and people need to eat food, and we're kind of hungry too, But in this one, it's Jesus that initiates it. And there's a reason behind that. Do I want to say it now, or do I want to link it to the real time I want to say it? I'll say it now, because if I forget. For the other three Gospels, it's more important theologically for those authors that it shows that the disciples are starting to be servants. So they're coming to Jesus, which is who disciples and servants should go to. In this gospel, Jesus is all power right from the get-go. He is deity. He is God incarnate. He doesn't need anyone to point out the flaws. He initiates everything. So that's part of why. We'll see a moment where that also takes place, and that was the moment I was referring to. So it's only John's gospel that mentions Philip as being, one of the players on the stage for this story. Why Philip? Not sure. Some scholars think maybe he was because he was from, as it mentions in Luke's gospel, from Bethsaida, which is near this area. Not really sure. Actually, it's in the beginning of John's gospel that says where Philip is from, and it's Luke's gospel that said it's near this area. But anyway, Philip is a player on stage. Now let's note all right, deep breath. Let me stop getting lost in the thematic and theological and symbolic tall grass and just focus on the narrative for a second. So Jesus asks Philip, and he said this to test him, as it says in verse 6. Previously in verse 5, where can we buy enough food for them to eat? He said this to Philip, verse 6, to test him, because Jesus already knew what he was going to do. He knows what he's going to do, but he asked Philip, says, hey man, how are we going to handle this? And look at Philip's answer. Note his answer. Verse 7. 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. Philip doesn't have an answer. number one. Number two, Philip doesn't lean into the person that he likely knows would have an answer. So Philip's answer to the question falls a little flat. And as it said previously, Jesus was asking him to test him. There are going to be people that say Philip failed. I don't want to frame it that way. I'll just say that Philip didn't give the best answer. He didn't give the answer that would have been the best one. All right, so we'll say that. Because he's not wrong. 200 days wages, yeah, he's not wrong. That there's a human impossibility in how to handle this, a logistic impossibility. So he's not wrong, but he doesn't give the best answer. We'll land on that. Now, verse 8. This is where it gets really cool. The other thing is, before I get to what's really cool, yes, Jesus is in control, as I mentioned. Jesus initiates it, as I mentioned. But it's cool that he's he's including his disciples. So he's not doing it, all on his own, but he's pulling them in and using them. He's facilitating their learning, facilitating their serving, facilitating their discipleship, which is really cool. Then verse 8. Verse 8 is where the story takes a little bit of a cool turn. One of his disciples, verse 8 and 9, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, the brother of Peter that we know. Andrew says to Jesus, "There is a boy who has only 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good are these for so many?" So, where Jesus previously had just instigated a conversation with Philip, initiated, I'll say, and Philip didn't give the best answer, Andrew, without being asked, Andrew offers some information to try to help, which is super cool. I enjoy Andrew a lot because we see differences in all of the major disciples, Andrew being one of them. And Andrew is somebody that is a doer, is a intermediary between others and Jesus. Andrew is always trying to do and say, all right, he brings Peter to Jesus in the beginning of this gospel, and now he's bringing the boy to Jesus. He's trying to bring a solution to Jesus. So Andrew's a doer. Andrew, has this quality about him. And, it's only this gospel that mentions this moment with Andrew. Only this gospel mentions this young boy, which is very interesting. Andrew brings this boy, like I said, just like he brought Peter, the fisherman, to Jesus in the opening chapter of this gospel. And if we note, what does he say? When it types Andrew, blah, blah, blah. 9. There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. When I did this Bible study, the Gospel of John at my church, did the Bible study for, 15 years, give or take, 20, I'm not sure. But we did the Gospel of John twice, actually, because it's big. All the studies we did were, big books, takes a while. As you could see, because I talk a lot. We talk a lot. So when we did the Gospel of John the first time, laying out all the themes, the symbolism, this and that, the people from my church, those that were attending this Bible study, quickly became very conditioned to see certain thematic and symbolic clues, particularly numbers. And when numbers took place, they all, sometimes, I think there's a couple times where it's like, no, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. The numbers being mentioned just to, denote an amount of something or whatever. But in this moment, it does mean something, particularly the number 7. You got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, 7. When I said that one of the themes was Jesus replacing the foundations and major pieces of Judaism and Jewish culture and Jewish religion and tradition and all of that. Also, parallel to that, this gospel as renewed creation, meaning creation happened that one time, and according to the 2 stories, one time, 2 stories in the book of Genesis. So there's creation, and then theologically, it is said, it didn't go great because, humanity and the nation of Israel, according to the story, has had its ups and downs and its, slip ups and speed bumps and not doing great in its journey and its relationship with God. So this author is saying that Jesus and all that's taking place is to renew creation, to start fresh anew. Thus the number 7, as in creation. according to the story, 7 days. Spoiler alert, it all comes to fruition and it culminates with the resurrection, which again, this author, I'm sorry, I'm jumping to a part that, we're not talking about, but it's important for the number 7 and why I'm bringing it up. The resurrection, that author does nothing by accident and times out, shows us exactly when each thing is taking place so that it all lands where Jesus is resurrected, not on the 7th day, but according to this author, on the 8th day. Because renewed creation, the original was 7 plus 1 is now perfection. 8. So 7, it's important. It's here. Now, getting back to the narrative and stepping away from these big, deep layers and levels of symbolism, 5 barley loaves. Again, this author does such a great job, in not just in the deep stuff, but also in the pure narrative stuff. And either does a good job of it theologically, because they have a theology that they want to tell, or narratively, because perhaps they were an eyewitness to it, or just a combination of both. But when it says barley loaves, it's very specific, which is cool in and of itself, but it's also cool because, context of the time, it was cheap bread. It was cheap bread that there would be people that would look their noses down on it, like, oh, you bought that at the dollar store. Poor you. So that's what it would have been like. So this boy who Andrew brings is bringing, and this boy is here saying, I got my 5 cheap barley loaves. It's the best I got. And the fish, the word that's used in the Greek for the fish, it's not like he's got, this beautiful white fish, this trout, or this Chilean sea bass, or this wonderful 2 pieces of salmon that he got at Whole Foods. No, it's like this relish type fish, almost like like cheap cans of sardines. Maybe it would be what we would think of, or not. I'm not sure, but it's like a cheap, fish paste almost. So it's showing that this boy, one, is prepared, came with food, knowing I'm going to this thing. Let me be prepared. But 2, also the boy doesn't have a lot. This is cheap stuff. So it's not somebody that has a lot to. It's not somebody that can afford to share. And Andrew brings and let's see, the boy planned ahead. Where also, let's note, the disciples did not. Philip didn't. Even none of them did. And as the other 3 stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke show, the disciples woefully unprepared. It shows that there was very little for Jesus to work with. This is it. 5 barley loaves, 2 fish, 7 told. It's not much, but somebody had written, I forget who, I can't give you credit, that's not much to work with, but Jesus will make up the difference. It's not much to work with, but Jesus makes up the difference. We might not have a lot to work with in and of ourselves, whether it's, our opportunities or circumstances or what have you, but Jesus makes up the difference. That's a beautiful message right there. Also, somebody else pointed out, and I'm not taking credit for coming up with this, my own smart people, thoughtful people, they asked the question, who does Jesus say we are to come to him like? Meaning, how are we to go to Jesus? Who are we to be like when we go to Jesus? I think that's a better way to phrase that. This individual says, little children. And this is a great example of it. Matthew chapter 18, go to Jesus, come to me like children. And I'm not quoting it exactly. So, also, this little boy did not have to sort of volunteer and make himself known to Andrew. Not that that's in there, but we'll just think that maybe it's inferred. He could have kept the food to himself because that's who he brought it for, and thought, well, my little bit of food's not going to help all these people. What am I going to do? I'll just eat it, and they'll take care of themselves. But no, him and Andrew bring it to Jesus so Jesus could do what Jesus does. Okay, so let's talk really quickly before we move on about Andrew and Philip. As we note, Philip doesn't rise to the occasion where Andrew does. Philip thought nothing could be done, where also in the Synoptics, so did the other disciples. But Andrew takes the initiative. He brings somebody to Jesus, just like he brought Peter. Jesus never asked Peter to do anything. Jesus never asked Andrew to do anything, but he steps up to be a servant as best he could. Andrew did this all on his own. That's a great example right there. And it took courage. It took a bravery, it took a courage, and I guess one would say a leap of faith. In Andrew's part, 5 loaves and 2 fish. He could have been told he was being a knucklehead. Bringing this boy with this, how's that going to help us? With his little bag lunch, that's not a solution, but Andrew does it anyway. So it took faith, and it took some humility. Andrew knowing he couldn't do anything about that or with this, but going to Jesus. He knew that this boy had something to offer, so Andrew helps facilitate that and brings it to Jesus. And he knew Jesus could do something. So he knew the spotlight, hey, boy, Jesus, I'll step off the stage now. That's wonderful. Think about it this way. This miracle does not take place without Andrew. It doesn't. Pardon me. And this might have been, as somebody noted, the test that Jesus was initially offering to Philip. But Andrew's the one that stepped up. I'm not going to say Philip failed. Andrew stepped up. So let's move back to the text here. So we had the Philip, the Andrew, the boy. Verse 9, the 2 loaves, the 2 fish, the 5 loaves. Slow down, deep breath. And then verse 10, Jesus said, have the people recline. Again, the above, below, the reclining, the above, below. It's always there. Now, there was a great deal, in verse 10, there was a great deal of grass in that place. So the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Let's take that one at a time. Again, the people reclining above, below. It's also a Passover type of reference, because that would have also been the same manner in which they had the Passover meal. And note Jesus now taking control, taking authority. And as one commentator who I love, I've used for years, says, Jesus takes the authority, and as a loving shepherd, he makes the sheep lie down in green pastures, referencing Psalm 23. So the fact that he's got these sheep, got these people in this, as it note, again, no detail is by accident. Yes, it could be just great narrative detail, but it's also got some cool symbolism to it, where have the people recline. There was a great deal of grass in that place. That wasn't necessary narratively and might be considered something that could narratively be cut, a detail, but it's there because, as this commentator connects it to, sheep. Jesus, in this gospel, one of the 7 I am statements is, I am the good shepherd. And he makes his sheep to lie down in green pastures. It's beautiful. Again, the grass, it's springtime. It's Passover, so it makes sense. Now, this is really, really phenomenally interesting. Also in verse 10, so the men were reclined. So the men reclined. So the men. If you look in certain Bibles, you will see at the heading of this story, Jesus feeds the 5,000, because it says 5,000. So it's always been numbered at 5,000. And then there's another story in the Gospel of Luke where it's 4,000. And it only mentions men, which is a little, not enjoyably patriarchal, but it also doesn't point out or indicate actually how many people are there. You could probably double it or triple it because it's not mentioning the women or the children, which kind of stinks. But I say that because it stinks, but I also say that because it obviously multiplies the miracle that takes place when all these people are fed and satiated, as we will see. So the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then, and here we start getting into some more deeper stuff that might have even jumped out at you when I read this. Verse 11, there we are. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining. Now, I will very much encourage you to go read the Matthew, Mark, and Luke versions. I would have liked that to make sure at some point you do that, because it's cool to get a side-by-side. And we'll get an idea of what happens in this moment with the others. Because for one, Jesus makes no reference, the author makes no reference to Jesus looking up to heaven as he gives thanks, like in the Synoptics, which is a little bit odd, you might think, maybe, if I've conditioned you enough to think, well, what about the above, below? Well, yeah, it's there. Jesus, where is it? Oh, my little light went out. I'm sorry if that changes the dynamic. Oh, this light is just not, the battery stinks. Anyway, hi, here I am. Yeah, it'll be okay. Where was I? Then Jesus took, in verse 11, Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks. Yes, so he doesn't look up, okay? I think that thematically, theologically, it's because in this gospel, Jesus is God. It's not a secret. He's giving the signs and declaring who he is from the get-go. So thematically and theologically, there is not the need to look up to God as he says this. God's already there, and that's already what he's been trying to say to everybody. Where in the Synoptics, it's that the Christology in this one is, oh, forget it. I'm drawing a blank on how I wanted to say that. Where in the Synoptics, it's Jesus going human to God. In this one, it's Jesus going God to human in his journey. He starts out as God, and then, we'll be human in this, but also still God. I'm sorry, I'm not doing a good job making that point. Bottom line, Jesus, there's no need for Jesus to connect to God in this thanks, because God is already there. The Synoptics choose to connect Jesus to God so that people can see that and all that. Also, this is the gospel right here, the Greek word that comes from verse 10. No, verse 11. Then Jesus took the loaf, gave thanks. This is the only gospel to use the word Eucharistio, to give thanks. And that's where we get the word Eucharist, which some denominations choose to call communion, Eucharist. So it does give this story that much more of the communion aspect to it as well, if you didn't already pick up on that. But that's part of it. It's wrapped in. And it's not surprising, since this is the latest gospel that traditionally we have an understanding was probably written. So where Mark may have been written around the 50s or 60s, some scholars are now thinking that might not be the case. Maybe it's later than we thought. But let's just land on what the traditional consensus is at the moment. Mark's written in the 50s to 60s. Matthew and Luke are written in 60s to 70s. And then John's gospel comes much later, 90s to 100 to maybe even 110. So at this point in time when this is being written, there is already underway a foundation of gathering together as Jewish Christians or as Gentile Christians or as Christians, or just all of them. And in those gatherings, those worship type gatherings, they've already incorporated as foundational to those gatherings, those worship gatherings, communion and baptism. So communion is already really starting to get very much established. So it's not surprising that it's now folded into this story as well. So we have the word Eucharist here. Now, when I mentioned before that it was Jesus that initiates this, and it's not the disciples that do, and I said, oh, there's another moment that's similar to that. It's this moment. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them, the food, to those who were reclining, to the people. It's Jesus that's doing it. Where in the Synoptics, like I said, it's very much about Jesus facilitating the disciples to do it. I don't want to say anointing. What's the word? Charging the disciples to it. I don't have the word. But anyway, in the Synoptics, it's Jesus doing the thanks, getting the stuff ready, and then giving it to his disciples, his servants, to serve the people. In this one, it's Jesus that's doing it, because Jesus, he's not letting anyone else do anything. It's all about him right now. I said that in the best way. It's all about him right now. That's what he did. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so, Jesus, the author focuses the power on Jesus as God, and would not want that power to be diminished, while the Synoptic Gospels are going to focus much more on discipleship. And it also can be seen and linked and echoes a little bit the Eucharist, with Jesus distributing that at the Lord's Supper as well. So it's there. Now, verse 12, and we're going to try to bring this in for a landing soon. We're going pretty long here, sorry. Verse 12, when they had their fill, so we see that when I said they were all satiated, everybody's eaten enough. Jesus said to the disciples, gather the fragments left over so nothing will be wasted. There are some authors that have some symbolic theme to that. I'm not going to go down those paths because I don't know that I believe them. I don't know that I subscribe to them. We'll say that. But one thing that people do talk about in Jewish thinking at the time, that when the Messiah comes, there would be overflowing banquets. Overflowing banquets. So the author might be connecting it to that, which is cool. I can land on that. I can live with that. And then verse 13, so they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets. 12 tribes of Israel. 12 is a very important number. 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. So it's just the 5 barley loaves being repeated here. 14, when the people saw the sign he had done, they said, this is truly the prophet, the one who's to come into the world. No, people, he's not the prophet. Yes, thematically, especially with Matthew's gospel, he is the prophet, but he's more than that, as that gospel and the other gospels will tell us. Again, I'm not knocking these people in this moment because they can't be expected to fully get it. For them, calling him a prophet is a huge deal, but they missed the mark. But it's also there because the author is doing that to point out he's the prophet. He has replaced Moses. He is replacing Moses. It will continue, but in terms of replacing these Jewish foundations and Jesus making everything better, taking it up, dialing it all up to 11, that's part of why that mentions that the people and the author say, this is the prophet, the one who will come into the world. Verse 14, then it ends with Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king. So he withdrew again into the mountain. So again, these people are not understanding fully who Jesus is, and we can't expect them to. They think he's the prophet, the king, this new King David, so to speak, that's going to come and bring them out of chains, out of, being a conquered people. They misunderstand who the Messiah is, and they misunderstand who Jesus is. So Jesus says, okay, this was cool. I did all this. Now I'm going to go withdraw alone into the mountain. As one commentator pointed out, and I never picked up on it, very similar to the temptations that Jesus faces in the wilderness. Particularly go read Matthew's version in chapter 4, where the people want to anoint him king. He's able to, the people are like, oh, this is awesome. This guy's going to be our new king. That's a test moment for Jesus. And it's happening again here. And Jesus said, no, I'm gonna go chill and get some peace in nature. So that's that. So that brings us to the end on that. What this will lead into in the next passage, which I encourage you to read, is what's known as the bread of life discourse, where Jesus will declare, I am the bread of life. And it will, be another I'm identifying who I am, and I've just given you one of these signs with multiplying these loaves. So it's all a big full narrative. This is just a part of it, and a part of it to show who Jesus is with this sign, part of it to show Jesus replacing the foundations of Judaism, Passover, Moses, bread of life, all of it. It's perfect. Some of the elements that do exist from the Exodus story to symbolically sort of tell that of replacing. You get putting Philip to the test is like the Israelites being put to the test. With the manna, the fish follows the bread, like the meat followed the manna. The crowd ate as much as they wanted, just like the Israelites were allowed to take as much as they needed. Jesus directed the disciples to gather the fragments, like God directed the Israelites to do the same. So again, it's partly on its way to doing what thematically and theologically the author wants it to show is being done, which is replacing these foundations, which I've said multiple times. And in the end, this is a moment of Jesus caring for the people. I'm doing all this unpacking, and there's so much here, but in the narrative, we have a wonderful event here that's told in all 4 of the Gospels, which doesn't happen. In the 3-year ministry of Jesus, setting aside the crucifixion, resurrection narratives, even those details aren't unanimous in all 4. There's differences, but this is one that exists in all 4, and there's only one other moment where that happens. So that makes this a very, very, very profound moment in the gospel story and in the story of Jesus. So it's a moment that has a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts, as I said, a lot of differences in the four stories as they're each telling different theological stories. But in the end, what's existing here to get us back on the ground and away from all the symbolism, this is Jesus caring for the people. This is Jesus, tending to the sheep, being kind, being loving, using his miraculous power to facilitate with the disciples and to use his servants and to just make something out of nothing and to feed people and to fill people and to love people. And that's beautiful. Deep breath. I'm going to stop there. Thanks be to God. Okay, my friends, thank you for being here. I hope you've enjoyed this video and this story. It was fun doing it. I love doing this. So I hope you found fruit in it. I hope it encourages you to read before and after John, or all of it, or any of it. And let me bring this all in for a landing. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being you. I love you all. I wish you nothing but peace and love and healing and comfort and whatever it is that you might need in this moment or on your journey going forward. And above all, I wish you fellowship with God in your journey. Have a great day. Have a great week. Love you all. Ciao, ciao.